Hello, and welcome to Unlocking Government Data, Module number 4, that will focus on a guide to accessing and utilizing public information. In this module, we will go over open data and data building blocks. All right, the objectives for this module are to understand the principles of open data and the ways to access it, understand a few ways that public data has been used to make a difference, and then understand the basic file formats CSV, KMZ, and shapefile. The key words that we will go over today are open data, public information, GIS mapping, environmental justice, and data analysis. Open data refers to the information that is freely available for use, reuse, and redistribution without restrictions. Open data is critical to helping provide transparency and accountability in government and industrial practices. Knowing how to access and use public data is critical for those looking to make a positive change in their communities. Open data and data are definitely not the same thing, and in fact, I would argue that the term open data is relatively new. For many years, scientists and others have collected data that was stored in vacuums. Complex decisions or decision-making was made without the public's knowledge of the data points. And in fact, there is a long history of a pretty extractive practice of doing studies and collecting data in communities that then goes on to help people get PhDs, but doesn't actually help the community. So we really want to focus through this class, and I hope throughout your time in advocacy, on pushing for open data, specifically government data, but scientists and others, especially if they're working in your community, they should provide that data back to you, and you should be able to use it as well. So open data, the short thing is, data is only good if you're able to use it. It has to be good data, but it also has to be accessible. If not, it is just something helping an individual person or organization, often not the greater good. All right. Public data implications for impact. So we just kind of talked about this. So closed data that's not accessible, may help make decisions and may help guide political choices. However, it is not something that can truly empower and engage those in the community that are most affected by those policy decisions. So public data is used to address critical issues such as healthcare disparities, urban planning, and environmental conservation. By analyzing public data, stakeholders can make informed decisions and implement targeted interventions for societal benefit. We're going to watch a video about some of the ways that public data is being used to visualize and to help change the way we're able to navigate in the world. Okay, let's walk through the principles of open data. Open data principles define how data should be made available to ensure it's accessible, usable, and fosters positive outcomes. Data should be open by default. This principle emphasizes a shift in how information is handled. Data should be considered open and freely available unless there is compelling reasons to restrict it. Privacy concerns, medical records, that might be something that made sense to not make available as open data. Data should be timely and comprehensive. Open data is most valuable when it is current and reflects the latest information. Additionally, data sets should be as complete as possible, providing a comprehensive picture of the subject matter. It is very important to remember that your results are only as good as the data that you put in. That is for you, for the government, for everybody. When complex decisions or any kind of decision is made with non-comprehensive data or faulty data, you get very questionable, if not horrible, outcomes. Data should be accessible and usable. Data should be discoverable, easy to access, and usable by a wide range of people. This means using open formats, clear documentation, and avoiding unnecessary barriers or limitations. In my organization, we do a lot of water sampling and we do a lot of mapping. Unless there is a specific reason, like we're building a case to go to a lawsuit, that data is made available in real time, publicly, all the time. We find that it is incredibly critical that our data and the data that we collect and then are able to use is put into a format and is made available for other community members so that they may use it to engage in whatever process they may need to engage in to make sure that they're protected, healthy, and able to thrive. Data should be comparable and interoperable. Open data should be formatted in a way that allows for comparison and integration with other data sets. This promotes data sharing and facilitates new insights when combining information from various sources. In future modules, we will get to how to begin to organize your data, how to format it, how to make sure your spreadsheets will all talk to each other. If for some reason you are collecting data that is going to be used with federal data, for example, or state data, making sure that you're collecting the same types of data, that you're collecting it in the same way as much as possible, and that there's an easy way to compare the two is incredibly important. Data should be used to improve governance and citizen engagement. Open data empowers citizens and stakeholders to hold governments and organizations accountable. It fosters transparency and allows for informed participation in decision-making processes. Again, the idea of government data being open and accessible is relatively new and is critical for any type of real meaningful citizen engagement. So as much as you can push the governments and those around you to make sure that the data they're collecting, largely taxpayer data, is made open so that you can access it and is made open in a way that you can access it. It really doesn't do you much good to get a giant PDF with all of the data in it. You want it in an Excel spreadsheet or in a format that's able to then be easily used. So in this instance, PDFs are not your friend. Data should be machine readable. There you go. Data should be available in formats that machines can easily understand and process. This allows for automated analysis and the creation of data-driven tools and applications. In this instance, a PDF is not machine readable. You can't understand it, and the ArcGIS or the other mapping programs, analysis programs can't understand information on a PDF. In a Word document, you might be able to pull it out, but making sure that it's machine readable is very important. Data should be non-discriminatory. Open data should be accessible and usable by everyone, regardless of background, technical skills, or resources. We actually still find this with some of the agencies. NOAA, which is the fisheries folks, and oceans, they still are collecting data that they put behind paywalls, largely because I think they feel the general public doesn't have the capacity to be able to understand and analyze that data. And that is a disservice to the community. It is also worth saying that oftentimes scientists and others that often use the data can be one of the biggest obstacles to open data. They find it often a challenge or a threat to sharing information out to the general public. Data should have clear and open licensing that are able to be used, that specify how the data can be used, shared, and modified, ensuring responsible use while promoting its wider application. So if you put data out, you want to make sure that you're providing information of how, often how you collected the data, how you want to see it used, or what applications that you think how it can be used responsibly. What are the limits to your data? Data should be used for inclusive development of information and development and innovation. The same as governance and citizen engagement, making sure that it's available, making sure that people can actually use the data and it's in a format that is, so necessity breeds invention, innovation, and that necessity will be empowered and enriched by providing data so that good decisions can be made, that good development can be made, good innovation. Data should have permanence once it is released. In open, efforts should be made to ensure that long-term availability and accessibility. This means once you put the data out there, as much as possible, let it stay. Historical data, for example, is incredibly important to help us understand how we got here today as a society. If we just had current data available, we wouldn't be able to access that historical data. So permanence, making sure once you put the data out there, especially if it's being used to make decisions, it stays. And then usage cost. The cost of accessing and using open data should be minimal or eliminated. This encourages widespread adoption and maximizes the value derived from your data. Make it so that everybody can use it. Again, just to drive it home, and you will hear this throughout the webinar, if it is publicly collected data, if it is taxpayer paid data, even if it is a university that has received government money for a study, that data by law is supposed to be released unless there is some HIPAA violation or some type of privacy concerns. Oftentimes there aren't privacy concerns. Oftentimes you just run into people not wanting to share data. All right, government data is public data mostly. Governments collect a lot of data using taxpayer funds. In principle, the data belongs to the public and should be accessible. As we are currently looking at a massive amount of federal funds being pushed down into communities in a myriad of different ways, all, if not most, if not all, of the data that is collected from those funds should be made available. It will remain to be seen how that plays out, but your government is paying billions of dollars for different companies and different infrastructure to be put out, and huge investments. And those investments can't happen in a vacuum, and they certainly shouldn't happen behind closed doors. Sharing of data is critical for transparency, innovation, and collaboration. And the one thing you can't access is personal data, medical records, their trademark secrets. So trade secrets is another one that you usually can't access. But if there's a question and it's government data, you should push. You should push and try and get that data as much as possible. All right. So how do we use data in our daily life? Government data impacts various aspects of daily life, from weather forecasts based on meteorological data to public health initiatives utilizing demographic data. Understanding and utilizing this data can enhance decision making and contribute to personal and societal well-being. Satellites and the way that the government tracks the weather and the changing patterns all rely on GIS. The data is transported back, made accessible, made on a map. In fact, when you look at a news broadcast and they show you what the weather's doing, it's on a map. That's because it's GIS. So that's a perfect way of looking at government data that is in your daily life. The other is public health initiatives, right? So tracking what's happening in different communities, what the health impacts of the surrounding area, or are they in food deserts? Are they in food swamps? What does that look like? All of that data can really be enriched by using some demographic data. So those are two easy ways that every single day we are using data and GIS on a regular basis. All right. Data is only as good as the information it's able to provide. So let's dig into a couple of ways that government uses and utilizes data on a regular basis.
The government collects data on a wide variety of subjects: the economy, climate change, crime, healthcare, and more. Its findings help shape policies from your hometown to your state to the whole country and even around the globe. Your tax dollars fund this research, but most of us probably don't realize how we make use of that data every day. Let's say you and your family are getting ready to move. You want to start by doing some research on your new neighborhood. How safe is it? How do the local schools rank? So you look to government crime stats and education data. Next, you pick a listing you like and you drive over to take a look. If you use GPS to get there, you're actually being guided by federal data. If you check the weather before you go, you're checking federal climate data. If you get hungry along the way and check Yelp for a good spot to eat, you might see local government health inspection scores posted on the site. You tour the house and decide you want to make an offer. The seller can use data from the Housing Finance Agency to determine their asking price. Okay, so you're ready to buy. The Federal Reserve uses economic data to set interest rates, which in turn help determine your monthly mortgage payments. And if grandma moves in with you, federal data on the price of goods decides whether she gets a bigger check from Social Security. So even when you're not the one using the data, it could still have an effect on your wallet. It's hard to pinpoint just how much the government spends on data collection each year, in part because it happens across so many different agencies. But chances are, in this case, you're actually getting what you pay for.
So by the end of this series of webinars, you will probably be sick of hearing about how government-funded data should be publicly available. But it should, and it's really important. So I'm going to continue to say it. Data collected with government funds is often required to be publicly available, enabling transparency and accountability. This principle ensures that information produced through public funding services serves the public interest and can be accessed by citizens for various purposes. Again, that also includes the people that the government gives money to collect data. Universities and others can be very difficult to get data out of that have been doing studies. However, if that study was federally paid for, you have, as a citizen, a right to push and try and access that data. Data restrictions. So there are some times where they'll come back and say, nah, just kidding, you cannot have this data and this is why. Entities like HIPAA, which is you sign every time you come to the doctor's office, says we won't release your records, this is who we can talk to. Department of Energy and Department of Defense have specific regulations to protect sensitive data related to health, energy, and national security. These restrictions aim to safeguard privacy, prevent misuse, and maintain national security interests. They can also, these restrictions, cause black holes and a lack of understanding to those that live around these resources. Department of Energy, Department of Defense are very high on that list. If you happen to live next to a federal army base or a military base, chances are that it's difficult to find data about any of the effects to those that are surrounding the community. But if you happen to be from Camp Lejeune or around Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where for many years, not only the soldiers and those that were in the military, but their families and those living around it were heavily contaminated with jet fuel and other stuff the military knew was in the groundwater, yet continued to provide out to its soldiers and to the families. That is a perfect example of why you have to push to get as much of this data out as humanly possible. So if you end up in a situation where Department of Energy, Department of Defense has data that you, or at least you think they have data, or they have practices that may be affecting your community, lean in and push them on it. Make good arguments of why they should be able to release it. You might not win, but at least you tried. All right. The role of environmental data. Environmental data is a critical tool to understanding your community and the issues it is facing. Environmental health and human health are intimately intertwined. This is a concept that I would argue 50, 60 years ago, everybody had probably a pretty good grasp on. In current society, we're not doing a great job of understanding that if you have a bunch of industries that are putting out high amounts of particulate matter into the air, you are likely going to have communities surrounding it with high amounts of asthma. If you have a battery facility that is allowed to emit lead out into the air and out into air, water, and into the ground, you are going to have children and people that live in the community surrounding it with lower IQ points and lead poisoning. There are direct effects that come from healthy or unhealthy environments. So the environment is not just for tree huggers. It is absolutely intimately intertwined with your ability to thrive, your community's ability to thrive, and the viability of your community, right? So if you happen to be in a neighborhood that is used to be surrounded by beautiful fields and is now surrounded by industries that are now polluting heavily in the air, your economic value of your house and your neighborhood is also going to be negatively affected. All right, we're going to watch a really neat video on Scientific America about examining the environmental justice movement led by activists like Dr. Robert Bullard focused on addressing the inequalities and advocating for marginalized communities. Data plays a huge, crucial role in highlighting these disparities and driving awareness for environmental justice issues.
The residents in this small community fear the worst for the future of their homes because of flooding. They say it is because of a 4-lane highway built by the state several years ago. The father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard, who grew up in this community over 50 years ago, is now back to help with
climate change. Expect within the next 30 years, the U.S. will see a 25% increase in flooding. But for Black communities, we're talking 40%. And you're going to destroy it with a highway? Oh, hell no. We're going to fight like hell. Well, Houston is a metropolis, and we are ground zero for a lot of major issues around dependency on oil and gas, the impact of climate change. Racial redlining was a form of discrimination that denied Black and brown communities loans and mortgages and infrastructure. Those areas that were redlined in the 1930s are the areas that are more prone to flooding, more prone to have more pollution, more prone to have urban heat islands where it's hotter, no green space, no green canopy. And as we learned, the last couple of years are the same places that have more COVID cases in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. When you map those, it's mostly lower income and people of color that are living with those hot spots. I started this work dealing with environment and race before it was a movement or the whole concept of environmental justice. You have to understand, this was 1979. There was no methodology, there was no protocol for mapping landfills. We actually went to archival records, old maps, old reports for the data, and we actually went out and got the addresses of landfills that we had found and physically stood on the site and see them. And I would tell my students, I said, Houston is flat. Anytime you see a mountain in Houston, be suspicious, landfill. And so we were able to find the landfills and incinerators or their artifacts where they were and put them on a map and color code those census tracts, locations, with magic markers. And yellow was a less than 10% minority and went all the way up to red being 50% or more. And it just so happened the vast majority of the pins, map pins, designating landfills were in the red in majority Black neighborhoods. 5 out of 5 of the city-owned landfills, 6 out of 8 of the city-owned incinerators, and 3 out of 4 of the privately owned landfills in Houston were located in predominantly Black neighborhoods. You know, I've been doing this work for 4.5 decades. These structural factors behind racism still persist. Some people just don't want to believe the data. They don't want to believe their own eyes. Dumping and Dixon was the first book on environmental justice. And I got letters, nasty letters, from publishers saying, well, the environment is neutral, it's objective. There's no such thing as environmental justice. Everybody is treated the same. Even today, there's a lot of that going on. The issue of justice still remains. America is segregated and so is pollution. And so if we are to solve many of our environmental problems, we have to solve the problems of inequality and use a justice and equity lens.
This is Houston, Texas, headquarters city for the...
As someone who came of age during the civil rights movement,
not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin.
I'm a bit impatient about the pace of change. And the pace of change when you have the facts, you have data, you have information, you have the science, and somehow all of that just doesn't get into policy and action. If I seem indignant, it's because I am, because we have the answers. We're at an emergency, and climate change is knocking on the front door, and somehow we're just sitting on the couch, twiddling our thumbs or watching TV. You know, these heat waves with flooding, with these hurricanes, you know, the world is burning. The world is on fire. And I think we have to speed up the solutions. 40 years is too long. We don't have 40 years.
So that was a really good insight, one into Houston, which is right in line with Louisiana. That whole entire zone of oil and gas industry outside of Louisiana is known as Cancer Alley. Houston is kind of the exact same boat, and it is very apparent, spending any time in both of those communities, that the pollution sources are directly located in communities that did not have a voice or did not have the ability to be heard when they were located. And unfortunately, a lot of that injustice is still going on today on a regular basis, and it's horrific. Where do you see environmental justice issues around you? So through this course, we will build a series of maps and a storyboard examining the environmental justice issues in Atlanta through the lens of redlining. What I would like you to do is, as we move forward, you will also build a map and a storyboard of an issue that you care about. Jot down a few issues now that you might want to explore. What we will do in future modules is you will create a Google Drive or wherever you want to store your data. And as we go through different government websites and as we go through different components, you will be pulling out data that you will find useful in building your map in the future. So I would encourage you, take a few minutes to think about your community or the issues that matter to you, and how you might build a map around helping tell the story of what plagues you the most. All right. Mapping data for analysis. So using GIS tools, environmental data can be mapped to identify areas affected by redlining, flooding, or lacking in green space. Heat maps and demographic overlays provide insights for urban planning and resource allocation to promote environmental equity and resilience. So as we move forward, once we get into mapping, we'll begin to talk about how you can take layers and lay them on top of each other and really start seeing the world in a different way. All right. Let's learn a little bit about redlining, flooding, and demographics. So, environmental data reveals historical redlining practice impacted communities, identifies flood-prone areas for disaster preparedness, and analyzes demographic trends for equitable resource distribution. Understanding these insights enables informed decision-making for sustainable development and social justice initiatives. Redlining may have happened 80 years ago, but the effects are absolutely still felt today. And you'll see that as we look at Atlanta, we can take the redlining maps and layer other data on top of it, and you can see how the effects of those choices are still affecting the communities that live in and around those areas today.
In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many Black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. So I want to talk about redlining because this is a term you may have heard, but most people don't actually know the history. In 1933, in the midst of America's Great Depression, when unemployment rates were 25% and millions of people were not only out of work, but many of them were houseless, the federal government, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, established an agency called the Home Owners Loan Corporation. Basically, it tried to make home buying much more affordable by subsidizing the cost of building and lending such that people would be able to afford to buy for the first time. Millions of Americans participated, except that when the Home Owners Loan Corporation began to issue mortgages, it came up with a scheme to decide which communities were deserving of loans and which ones weren't. They made maps and used a color-coded scheme. Green meant this was a community that you could lend to, and red meant you could not. The basic decision they made was to determine that any community with the presence of Black people or brown people or people who perhaps spoke Italian in certain parts of the country could not receive support from the Home Owners Loan Corporation. This created a system that came to be known as redlining, because communities that were deemed risky by the mere presence of people of color, most especially Black people, were disqualified from getting direct support from the federal government to purchase homes. This policy lasted until 1968, when the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act, which made all forms of discrimination in the buying and selling or renting of homes illegal. But the truth is that the legacies of redlining from that moment to the present meant that Black people were subjected to other forms of exploitative lending. A system called contract buying grew up as a way to sell Black people homes on a layaway plan. You made set payments over an extended period of time, but you never owned the home until the very last payment. It was very common for unscrupulous sellers to withhold that final payment in an effort to take back the home from a person who had worked incredibly hard to buy it. Home ownership has been the most important asset that a typical white family has in order to do simple things like borrow money to send a child to college. But most importantly, they have financial freedom. But for communities that have been subjected to redlining, they didn't have those advantages. Not only that, the very communities that they lived in suffered from divestment, including the lack of grocery stores, the lack of businesses, the imposition of federal highways that often bisected their communities. In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many Black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. And to this day, the median wages and income of those communities and the financial insecurity that people who live in redline communities face has long-term health consequences for families, has educational consequences for young people whose schools often don't have the tax basis to give them the same resources that communities that were never redlined actually have.
All right, as you watched that video and the previous video, how do they use data? How does he use data? You saw a myriad of different maps throughout, different ways to highlight some of the disparities that exist. In fact, in the first video, you heard him even complaining about the fact that the data does exist and change is so slow, right? So what do you hear that you think could be mapped out? Redlining. So redlining is available in most big cities online. So we'll show you that. Heat maps. So heat maps actually, that's not a temperature thing. Heat maps are the concentration of a particular item. So maybe it's grocery stores. So you could look at a map and the heat map would show you, if you were in a place that had food deserts, how all of the grocery stores are located in affluent areas or certain parts of the community, and how little there was in other parts of the community. So in that instance, the heat map would show a lot more heat in a place where there was more grocery stores. The same thing could be said for polluting industries, right? You could do the pollution amounts, and heat maps would show you where, even if you had 15 different facilities that were putting out nitrous oxide throughout your community, it would look at where are they most highly concentrated. So in the first video, they were talking about landfills. So they didn't have the access to ArcGIS and some of the other stuff that we're going to work through here. So they actually did it by paper. But what they were doing was creating heat maps to show that 5 out of 5 of the city landfills, for example, were located in Black communities. Flooding is another great example, whether looking at your FEMA maps or looking at what areas are regularly flooded. And in some instances, and in many instances, you can actually look at what is expected in the future when it comes to flooding, either from climate change or another neighborhood coming in upstream that puts in a lot of impervious surface, or surface doesn't allow the water to absorb into the ground. Canopy cover. We will actually explore canopy cover. That's the amount of vegetation and trees. So he mentioned that even today you can see a vast difference in the amount of vegetative cover in redlined communities. Redlined communities tend to have concrete. They tend to have smaller, less mature trees versus the non-redlined communities that tend to have more mature trees, more cover, and as a result tend to be actually significantly cooler in the summertime. As somebody who lives in the Deep South, I can tell you that is incredibly important. And then educational gaps. You can look at Title I schools. You can look at testing scores and easily map out who. You could look at investments. You could actually look at and see how much money is going into these different schools and be able to map out whether there are disparities or not. All right, there are a number of different ways to access public data. So it can be, most often, the easiest way is to go to the website and to find the data portal or to find the map. A lot of times the open data portals will allow users to download data sets directly. We'll get into the types of formats that you want to download your file in, but it's definitely not PDF. You do not want data in PDF. Additionally, APIs, application program interfaces, provide a way for developers to access and integrate public data into applications programmatically, enabling dynamic and real-time data retrieval. So say you are tying into, or you want data out of one of the government websites, the impaired waterways in Georgia, for example. So all of the creeks and streams that don't meet the basic qualification of swimmable, drinkable, fishable. But I don't want to pull that file on a regular basis, go back to the website, pull the new data down, and then pull it into my map. I can actually work and create or tap into an API, which is essentially a very long code that will continually talk to that website. And anytime new information is put on the website, it is also located on my map. Popular data formats. So knowing what they mean, where to use them is critically important. So how you save that data when you bring it down from the website will have significant effects on how you're able to manipulate it and use it in the future. So saving data in formats like KMZ, Shapefile, and CSV in Google Drive ensure accessibility in organizations for future reference and analysis. KMZ is only Google Maps, Google Drive. CSV is my preferred and shapefile. CSV we'll get into in nauseating detail throughout this course, but KMZ in general, if you're going to work in Google Earth, you're going to work in Google Drive, that is the file that you want. The problem is that it is applicable nowhere else. So let's explore a few of these and their uses. A CSV. So CSV is a comma-separated value. It is very widely used. It is probably the most common, and it is uploadable into almost every single system. So the key characteristics, so it is a row representing records or entries in the data. Columns represent the data fields or the attributes, and then commas separate each value within the row. The content, so you can store various data types like numbers, text, dates, and it's very readable. So you can open it up in your notes on your computer or in Word document, and you can edit it very easily without having to know code. So that's what makes CSV easy. And there is a module coming up all about spreadsheets that will go into CSVs in more detail and explain to you what rows, columns, how the spreadsheets are laid out. All right, so here's an example of a CSV file structure. So the name, age, city. So you see, so each one of these, so the name, Alice, Bob, Charlie. That is one column straight down. Name, age, city, that's a row. Right? So, and there's a comma in between each one. So that is telling the computer when you put it in that here's your rows. Your rows are your individual people, and then your columns are the different attributes or the different things that you want to know about those individual people. They're popular choice for data exchange due to their simplicity, flexibility, and universal compatibility with various software programs. They're a great option for sharing and working with data in a structured and easily accessible format. KMZ. A KMZ file is a compressed archive format specifically designed for geographical data used with mapping software like Google Earth. It is essentially a zip file. A zip file is a compressed file that contains the main KML file. So this is a file written in keyhole markup language, KML, that specifies geographic features like place marks, polygons, 3D models, and descriptions. The supporting files that go along with it, the KMZ file, can also bundle additional files referenced by the KML file, such as images, icons, textures, or sounds filed used for richer visualization within the map. Again, KMZ is for Google Earth. If you're going to work in Google Earth, you're going to want KMZ. If you're not, then KMZ is not going to be applicable to you and can actually be a pretty frustrating format to work with. Purpose is it stores and packages geographic data to use in mapping applications. The structure is compressed zip archive containing a KML file and potentially additional reference files. The benefits are a smaller file size, compression reduces download time and storage requirements, offline viewing, so it does allow, you can put it directly into Google Earth, you don't have to be online to see it, and it engages rich visualization, so it supports various data types like images and 3D models for enhanced map displays. If you encounter a KMZ file, you can typically open it directly with mapping software like Google Earth or applications that support KML format. The last one that we'll cover for now is shapefile. A shapefile is a digital format specifically designed for storing geospatial vector data used in GIS software. Here's a breakdown of its key characteristics. So vector, we'll learn vector and raster later, but vector means points, lines, polygons. Raster is actually like pixels, so it's pictures. This is specifically for vector data. So the purpose is to store the location, shape, and associated attributes of geographical features like points, lines, and polygons. A shapefile isn't a single file, but it's a collection of several files working together. So you have your main files that are actually storing your geometric shapes, points, line, polygons for the features, and then you have an index file that helps locate features within that shapefile for a faster access. You can have optional files built into it, a DBase table, often used with older GIS software that stores attribute data, which is attribute data is the descriptive information, columns, that's where you store your attribute data associated with each feature in the shapefile. A PRJ file or similar defines the projection system used for the geographic coordinates, ensuring accurate positioning on the map. Shapefile is very widely used. It is a common format that most GIS software uses. It makes data exchange and collaboration easier. It's a relatively simple structure, so it's easy to understand and work with compared to some of the other GIS data formats. And it's efficient in storage. So it stores the vector data efficiently, represents features using geometric shapes rather than raster data. So the raster data is much bigger. Limitations. It is not ideal for complex data. So it is points, lines, polygons. But large data sets, this is probably not appropriate. And it has limited topological information. So it doesn't inherently capture relationships between features. So like when one polygon borders another, it doesn't actually capture all of that. So whereas your raster would. Overall, shapefiles are a versatile and well-established format for storing and working with basic geospatial vector data in GIS software. I highly doubt that we will, from this class, you will learn or engage in any map making that would not allow for the use of a shapefile with most of your data. All right, how do you find and download those data sets? So government data sets can be accessed through platforms like data.gov, wide range of topics including demographics, healthcare, education. Researchers and analysts can download these data sets in various formats for analysis and insight. There is an entire module on how to access different government websites, which I would encourage you to spend some time, bookmark, and go back to, so that as you are looking for data in the future, there's a very good walkthrough of how to use each one of those websites. Saving the data on the Google Drive. So throughout the class, we'll be compiling and building blocks of telling a story. And so I'd really like you to set up a Google Drive or a drive on your computer so that you can start pulling these files in and storing them so that we can use them later. And as you pull them in, it's going to be really important that you name them correctly, making it much easier as you're going to use them down the road. All right, our key takeaways. Transparency and public benefit are key to open data. Public data, especially that funded by taxpayers, should be made available, should be open, and it is key to holding governments accountable, creating solutions for issues like healthcare disparities and environmental justice. Accessibility and understanding. Data needs to be accessible, and it needs to be in a way that is understandable, and it needs to be timely. And it impacts your life. Every day, data is everywhere. You cannot ignore it. You might as well understand it, but you cannot navigate the world today without data. Weather forecasts, public health initiatives, government data shapes everything. Learning to access and analyze this data empowers informed decision-making for yourself and your community. All right, now we've reached our quiz. 1. What is the main benefit of open data? A. Increased government secrecy. B. Transparency and accountability. C. limited public access to information. 2. What are some examples of how public data can be used? A. Weather forecasting. B. Urban planning. C. Both A and B. What does the principle open by default mean? Data should be data should be freely accessible unless there is a strong reason to restrict it. B. All data should be restricted for public safety. C. Open data requires a special license for access. Number 4. Why might some government data be restricted? A. To protect sensitive personal information. B. To maintain national security. C. Both A and B.